Okay, welcome everybody. Hello, thank you for joining me. Thanks for the folks who are here with me on Zoom, and welcome to everybody joining over the live stream on Facebook. So my name is Matt Sturm. This is talk number 2 in my 4-part series called The Organic Masculine. And yesterday we covered, or I gave my best response to the question, what is masculinity? And today we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to explore what I'm calling integral masculinities. Again, just for how I hold this and where I show up to this conversation from. This is an exploration. I don't pretend to know all of the answers, but as somebody who has explored this and gone deeply into myself around this, I'm just excited to share back kind of my field notes, where I'm coming from. So please take this, digest it, interpret it. It's not the doctrine or the one objective truth, but it's a perspective. And along with that, your perspective, your opinions, your questions are totally welcome. So for the folks on Zoom, if you have any questions along the way, just type them into the chat, and then we will likely have some time at the end for other questions if you have them. So feel free to chime in. So with that, we begin with a quote. Raywin Connell. It's clear from the new social research as a whole that there is no one pattern of masculinity that is found everywhere. We need to speak of masculinities, not masculinity. Different cultures and different periods of history construct gender differently. And that is the perspective that's the foundation of what we're looking at today, that in fact, there are many different types of masculinity. And so as we are exploring what masculinity may mean for ourselves, it's helpful to hold the wide view that there's many different forms out there. And we can see that each form has its own shadows, has its own light and goodness in its expression, and its own particular flavor, its own cultural richness. So the lens that we're going to be using today to explore different types of masculinity is integral theory. And in particular, here are the 4 flavors or versions of masculinity that we'll cover: traditional, modern, postmodern, and integral. Each has its own valid worldview, and each has its own unique strengths and shadows. So where do these 4 come from? Integral philosophy has been popularized by Ken Wilber, but there's a whole group of authors and thinkers out in the world who are working on this topic, something very near and dear to my heart. And in integral theory, there is a developmental framework, a natural, what is called a growth hierarchy, that humans move through, both as individuals, starting at birth, and then as we develop into adults, and collectively that humanity has moved through at the civilization level. And it has gone through a series of becoming more complex and more holistic. And it does this by going from paradigm to paradigm to paradigm. So what do I mean by the word paradigm? A paradigm of consciousness is an organizing story about the nature of self and world. It is, by story, I mean it's the interpretive framework. It's the lens through which I view reality and make sense of it. Paradigms are held subjectively by individuals, by you and me, and intersubjectively by groups of individuals, by cultures. So our paradigm is our interpretive lens, and what makes it a paradigm is it holds our values, assumptions, beliefs, myths, and identities about the world, about reality and self. Each paradigm is internally coherent. So from within the paradigm, it explains the world and everything makes sense. Paradigms are discrete, so there's one paradigm and then another paradigm and then another paradigm. They tend not to blend into each other. And they're sticky. And what I mean by the word sticky is when I'm in a paradigm, I tend to be centered in that, and we don't tend to hop from paradigm to paradigm to paradigm. Rather, this is the lens that I'm viewing the world through, and it may take me months or years of my life, or this may be the lens for my life. And then at a certain point of development, I may step into a new one, and then I'm viewing the world through that new lens, which transcends but also includes the old lens. So this will make a little bit more sense if we look at the actual paradigms themselves. So here they are. This is not all of them, but these are the main ones that I'm going to focus on for today. As it says, they form a developmental ladder. So at the bottom of the ladder, we have the mythic traditional paradigm. What grows out and builds on top of and then transcends that is the mental modern paradigm or worldview. And then from that, we have the plural postmodern paradigm. And then finally, integral, which is still being formed. It's the newly emergent paradigm, kind of at the cutting edge of the developmental consciousness that we all are working on now. So let's take a look at each one of these individually so that we can get a sense for what they are. And then after I cover each paradigm, we'll go back through them again and look at how each one of these paradigms interprets masculinity. And that'll be like the core focus of what we dig into today. So starting at the bottom part of the ladder, mythic traditional, again, this is the lens, this is the worldview for how we interpret. So the self here is the hero. I am the chosen one, or we are the chosen people. Nature through this paradigm is seen as something to be conquered by mankind and ruled. It's part of our dominion. Or nature can be seen as something that's evil, like the devil's playground. The core values from this paradigm are belonging, conforming, and tradition. It's about being part of an in-group, part of a tribe of people who all believe and adhere to this one story, this one myth about reality. Primary motivation is loyalty. It's remaining loyal to the group. And that one myth has a story for salvation about how we, as the chosen one, or the chosen people, can reach the heaven or nirvana or the promised land somehow, someday. How we get that salvation is through practicing the morals that go along with our social structure. Oftentimes that morality and the path to salvation is revealed through God, or fill in the blank, the divine transcendent other, religion, and mythology. So this is often propagated by organized religion. In terms of where most humans are at in Western culture and actually globally, the largest bucket of people is this paradigm. It's not 51%, but the biggest bucket of population of people are viewing the world through, the Christian or the Jewish or the Buddhist or whatever version of this lens. Moving on from here, the next developmental lens is the mental modern paradigm. And this emerged collectively in the 1700s, in Western civilization with what is known as the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And whereas in the prior paradigm, the self is the hero and the chosen one, here the self is the rational mind. So Descartes' famous words, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is the birth of the rational mind. And that is what reigns supreme in the mental modern paradigm. This paradigm gave birth to democracy. It gave birth to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, modern science, modern medicine, and business as we know it. From this worldview, nature is seen as a collection of resources. And those resources are here to be extracted and put to work in our project of building empires and building civilization. How nature works is governed by the rules of science. So the scientific method reigns supreme, whereas in the prior paradigm, the myths, the mythology, is what tells us about how nature works and what reveals truth. Core values at this paradigm are logic, so reasoning, mathematics, scientific method, and then achievement. We're really here focused on becoming, climbing the ladder, getting to the top of the pyramid, so to speak. So the motivations here are competition. I'm in competition with other people, whether it's through the workplace, largely through the workplace, or in academia. And because the egoic mind is the center of this paradigm, the egoic mind wants to be seen doing a good job and seen as smart and wise and doing well. So prestige is also a motivation here. Truth is no longer revealed by God, religion, and mythology. Truth here is revealed by science and the philosophy and metaphysics that goes along with it. Spirituality has shifted from largely monotheistic organized religion to agnosticism and atheism. Science reigns supreme. So that is this paradigm, and it is a major paradigm, major worldview in Western civilization and American culture today. Next, we have the plural postmodern paradigm. So this emerged, somewhere around the 1960s and is still growing, still filling out in our culture today. Postmodernism moves beyond the rational mind of modernism as like the sole arbiter of what is right and true. So the self from this paradigm is seen as socially constructed, and then because I recognize that myself is a layer of socially conditioned identities, race, gender, religion, ethnicity, roles that are put on me, then I start deconstructing those roles, start taking away the things that aren't really true. Nature from this paradigm is seen as a victim of humanity's greed. And in fact, a large part of this worldview has emerged in response to the ills and the wounds and the imbalances of the prior two paradigms, where nature is seen as man's dominion to be exploited or a kind of lifeless collection of resources to be used at our will. Here, the Save the Earth movement arose in response to what humanity has been doing in the prior two paradigms. Core values are sensitivity and nonviolence. So instead of rationality and logic ruling supreme, there's now space to start feeling, to start emoting. And from connecting and being more sensitive to our feelings, we also start to recognize and care about the feelings of others. There's an even stronger emphasis here on doing no harm. So the motivations are social justice, whether those are ecological justice or political justice, activism of all types, inclusion, like really wanting to be multicultural and make space for all of the voices that may not have been centered in our culture, and then sustainability. How this paradigm connects to truth? Well, there is no capital T truth. All truth is relative to the observer. So each one of us has our own truth. Each group of people has their own truth, their way of interpreting the world. And in fact, there is no one truth that's objectively, that's the fact. Everything is subjective, interpreted by who's doing the viewing. Spirituality from this paradigm is humanitarian, and the New Age movement has arisen along with it. But humanitarianism really is like the focus of most folks in this paradigm. We are caring about humans, the suffering of humans, and the freedom of humans to get to express themselves and be in themselves. So then we cross this dotted line into integral. The integral paradigm is characterized by wholeness. We see ourselves and we see the world fundamentally through the lens of whole. So the self is a holistic self system. Nature is this interconnected web of life. It's a living, breathing organism, Gaia, and it's like a one unitary living system. The values here are on self-actualization, like becoming everything that I'm able to become. And as I said, on wholeness. How do we do that? We do that through evolution. So whereas the prior paradigm, postmodern, is really focused on healing, becoming sensitive to our feelings, this one is focused on evolving, it's on creating. And it's not just solo evolution, it's through interconnection. It's recognizing the already existent connections that we have, both culturally, interpersonally, and to nature. Where we source truth from this paradigm is an integration of science and spirituality. They're no longer seen to be at war with each other or fighting against each other. Rather, we're able to find the common place of truth, that kernel that lies beneath, that both of those systems are pointing towards. The way that we're able to discern that is from the wholeness of our direct experience. So I'm finding truth within myself, and then I'm confirming it through different spiritual or scientific traditions and writers. Spirituality that's most often associated with this paradigm is called pan-experientialism. And the idea here, just briefly, is that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of creation, and that consciousness is imbued with all layers and all levels of existence. It goes all the way up and it goes all the way down. The idea is that, we are conscious beings as humans, but there's some consciousness that mammals hold, and there's some consciousness that reptiles hold. And if you continue to go down and down and down and down to atoms, to subatomic particles, there's no place where you can draw the line and say consciousness stops here. And so rather, from this perspective, consciousness is fundamental, and all phenomena are imbued with some amount of consciousness, however faint. So this is just a very brief and a very quick overview of these paradigms. Personally, I go super deep. There's so much that could be said about them. But for the sake of our conversation today, I just wanted to give an introduction to them so that we can use them as our framework to step into masculinity. So each one of these paradigms, mythic traditional, mental modern, plural postmodern, and integral, looks through its individual lens at the world, at gender, and at masculinity. So they each have their own story that they tell. So let's go through it, starting at the bottom of the ladder again, mythic traditional, and then working our way up. And again, just as a note here, for all of these that happen from here forward, largely this is just my interpretation and my perspective. So take it with a grain of salt. And if it lands for you, great. And if it doesn't, just let it go. I've also included some perspectives of other authors here on masculinity at these layers so that you're getting multiple perspectives. So the mythic traditional masculinity. Manhood follows myths, traditions, and social roles. So the stories that we tell ourselves about masculinity forms that picture of what it means to be a man. In American culture, this is largely defined as the man being the provider and a fighter / protector. The men who go to war, the men who fight, the men who protect, the men who do the work and provide for their families. In his light from this paradigm of consciousness, the man is strong, he's brave, he's honorable, disciplined, faithful, dutiful, and virtuous. In his shadow, he's domineering, violent, oppressive, self-reliant, unfeeling, and even fundamentalist. And the shadows of this particular paradigm of masculinity is when we have the conversation around what's wrong with masculinity in the world, most people are pointing here. This is where patriarchy lives, like the traditional form of masculinity. So what I want to suggest is that there is both a healthy version of masculinity that lives here and a unhealthy or oppressive or wounded version. Let's look a little bit more at what these two might contain. So here's an author, Stephen Mansfield. I get a kick out of this guy. He wrote a book about being manly. And here's a quote. I'm talking about the kind of manhood lived by bold, caring, principled, passionate men. I'm talking about the kind of manhood that makes a family whole, a woman safe, a child confident, and a community strong. I'm talking about a manhood rooted in heritage and honor and devotion to tribe. It is often rowdy and eager for fun, but always on duty and never fails to mind the borders of the territory it is assigned. He goes on later in the book to say, manly men live to the glory of God. So here's a perspective on what it means to be a man, on masculinity, that comes from tradition, is connected to religion and God. And, he says rooted in heritage. So the traditions of what has been passed down to us are very deeply honored. In addition, it's focused on family values and community. So it's about being part of this in-group, part of this tribe. He says devotion to tribe. These are all characteristics of the mythic traditional paradigm of consciousness. So what he's describing here is kind of the bright picture of the ideal man at this level. Where we're going next is the other end of the spectrum. So Peggy Sanday is an anthropologist who works on gender, and she's written some amazing books. Feminine Power and Female Power, Male Dominance is one of her books, which I just love. So here's a quote for how she defines male dominance in her anthropological studies of different cultures. Male dominance is restricted in this study to two general types. First, there is the exclusion of women from political and economic decision-making. Second, there is male aggression against women, which is measured here by the following 5 traits. The expectation that males should be tough, brave, and aggressive. The presence of men's houses or specific places where only men may congregate. Frequent quarreling, fighting, or wife beating. The institutionalization or regular occurrence of rape. And raiding other groups for wives. Now, if you're thinking that this only happens in, tribal villages somewhere in remote parts of the world, consider that all of these, to greater or lesser extents, at some point could easily apply to fraternity houses in college campuses. And in fact, this is a point that Peggy makes. So it's not, our culture is not above this. We still have this happening. And this is the shadow of this particular type of masculinity from this paradigm. In terms of gender theory, there are a couple of theories that fit in here. One is called biological determinism. It goes by a couple of different names, but biological determinism is kind of the catch-all bucket. And here's kind of how the argument goes. 10,000 years ago, in agrarian societies, men came to wield power and authority in the economic and political spheres because men are physically stronger. So they did most of the field work, and they're the ones who handled conflict, both in terms of fighting for resources and protecting from invasion. Women who operate a plow while pregnant suffer higher rates of miscarriage. And agricultural fields tend to be located farther from the home, making it challenging to both care for small children and work for the fields. So when humanity went from hunter-gatherers and started to settle down into what is properly like the first civilizations, agrarian societies, we see a shift into men wielding more economic and political power. Biological determinism explains it based on these physiological reasons. And so they would say, so the argument goes that instead of using the word patriarchy, which carries a whole series of biases around oppression, that we could reframe this as being patrifocal, and that patrifocal societies are an adaptation, not a form of oppression. So while it may be true that there is a certain amount, so while there may be a certain amount of truth in this argument from what happened to human civilization 10,000 years ago, equally true is that we no longer live in an agrarian society today. And so the reasons for men to wield power and authority in economic and political spheres, this is my opinion, no longer hold. We don't really need that anymore. So we can update society. But this is an argument that you will hear from people who do research like I do. Along with this, kind of the other side of the coin is feminist essentialism, which is a subset of radical feminism. And feminist essentialism kind of agrees that there are these fundamental essences. Genders have an essential quality, meaning that they are universal or natural, based on the natural world. And in the feminist essentialism argument, all humans are fundamentally both sexual and gendered. And through being both sexual and gendered, we have this inherent quality to us. The feminist essentialist argument goes on to say that men are kind of lacking. That women should really be the focus of power and authority in our society because, and here's a quote, men lack the special life-giving power that women possess in virtue of their biological capacity to become mothers. So here, the prior argument that because men are stronger and willing to fight, that they should wield the power and authority. The flip side is that because women are able to give birth and become mothers, they are the ones who should wield the power and authority. They're both based on this idea that there is an essential masculine and essential feminine nature that we're tapping into. And to a certain extent, I think that there is some truth to both of these arguments around our instincts. There are physiological and biological differences between men and women. And it's certainly true that I will never become a mother. So kernels of truth in here. Okay. Our next level, the mental modern paradigm. Masculinity here. Men are builders, entrepreneurs, and scientists. They are agents of liberal progress. So with the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, we saw the American Revolution, the French Revolution, huge changes in how we governed ourselves. And together with that, a rise in quality of living for all people who participated in the system, to greater or lesser degrees, but really a lifting up. And together with that, a recognition of the universal rights of all human beings, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, one example. So men, our job here is to be agents of this liberal progress. We can do better. We can build it. In his light, this man is innovative, adaptable, intelligent, high-performing, and problem-solving. And remember again that this is centered in the rational mind. In his shadow, we have this man being a consumerist, materialist, workaholic, egocentric, decadent, and sexually objectifying. Consumerist culture, sexual objectifying culture, and the way that that is woven into capitalism comes out of, has been birthed by this modern paradigm. So the way that masculinity participates in that has a shadow, for sure. So an example of what men aspire to, John Stuart Mill, so an Enlightenment age philosopher, says, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental or spiritual. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as men seems good to the rest. Each to live as seems good to the rest. So my self-determination through my rational mind leads to a set of freedoms that we recognize are inalienable to all people. One critique of how masculinity plays into this paradigm is called Marxist feminism. So capitalism and the male elite profit from female subordination. We pay women less, the system. We pay women less. We force them to do less technical or high-level work. We keep them doing housework in the household, and because of that, the men are able to profit more, and the capitalist system has some kind of indentured servitude built in that the system profits from. This happens at a collective level, but also individually. Men profit when their wives do housework, because that frees them up from having to do housework and spend the time on that so that they can advance their careers. In addition, from this perspective, married men are less likely to revolt. So there is an incentive from the system to get men to marry women. And then when men marry women, women go into the subordinated role. Capitalism also here profits by the exploitation of women as sex objects. And that's like very alive in our culture still today. So kernels of truth here as well. Liberal feminism is another perspective that came about, in the last 100 or 50 years and is really centered in this rational Enlightenment age perspective of paradigm of consciousness. Liberal feminism could also be called first wave feminism or mainstream feminism. And the argument generally goes like this. Women are as rational as men, equally deserving of human rights. And recall that prior to the Enlightenment age in like feudal medieval Europe, this was not seen to be the case. So with the Enlightenment age and the democratic revolutions that followed, women were able to obtain for themselves political, legal, and moral freedoms. This is not completely the case today. The recent, contemporary legal system around women's bodies and abortion is one example where, from the liberal feminist perspective, we have not completely liberated women's rights. But by and large, particularly compared to where we were 300, 400 years ago, we've really come a long way in this regard. From this perspective, it is the responsibility of government to ensure gender equality in the political and economic spheres, parenthetical, and to remain neutral in the private sphere. And again, we went a long way, but we didn't quite totally get there. So if we look at salaries in the workforce, we're still not paying women equal salary to men, generally speaking. So the ideal is there, and there's still a lot to be fighting for, frankly. So now let's move on to the plural postmodern version of masculinity. Or rather, I guess I would say maybe the non-version of masculinity. So from this paradigm, I recognize that cultural conditioning and the stories that our society tells us largely create what I think of as my gender, and therefore is not essentially me. And so most men in this paradigm have done some amount of work to deconstruct that false conditioning, the social layers that are not truly me. We are deconstructing masculinity. This leads to sensitive men focused on inner healing and outer activism. I want to heal the places where I've participated in the old paradigms of patriarchy, etc., heal that within myself, and then become an activist to make the world a more free, more just place. In his light, this man here is feeling access to his emotions. He's compassionate. He cares about others. He's feminist. He's pro-feminist. He's multicultural, and he's a systems thinker. He sees more than just like one perspective. He sees how different parts interact to create a larger whole. In his shadow, it is possible to become overly sensitive, to become sensitive to the point where everything is too much and overwhelming. It's possible to become feminized as opposed to feminist. And what I mean by that term is a disowning of masculinity and an attachment to feminist, to the feminine as an ideal or better way to be. The future is female is one tagline at this level. This man may be enrolled in victim-perpetrator drama, either seeing himself as a victim of society or seeing himself as a perpetrator, as a man who has done harmful things towards others. And then like the really tough nugget for this one is moral relativism and nihilism. So the idea that we all have our own truths, there is no one universal truth. Well, first of all, if we all have our own truths, then there's nothing holding it beneath, and it can lead to the sense that nothing actually matters. In addition, the other trap with that statement is there are no universal truths is itself a universal statement about the nature of reality. And it is its own privileged position that oftentimes we speak from, that I have spoken from this layer of consciousness. And so if I proclaim that there are no universal truths, that is itself a contradiction and doesn't lead to good things happening, let's say that. So that's the shadow. Here's an author, British masculine author at the postmodern. He's an academic who I really appreciate. He has a book called New Men, Old Men, and a couple other books, and he's great. So masculinity at this level, we're talking about masculinity and we're pulling apart the ways that it doesn't work, masculine deconstruction, rather than talking about what masculinity is. And so here's a illustrative quote. My argument has been that instead of innocently bearing witness to the experiences of men in what might otherwise be perceived as an overly feminine spiritual economy, masculine spirituality actually promotes an all too familiar patriarchal spirituality. This patriarchal spirituality encourages a certain type of hegemonic masculinity that dominates women and subordinates masculinities. It does this chiefly by defining masculinity by archetypes, revising the definition of and depoliticizing patriarchy, and encouraging what it perceives to be an authentic masculinity via the adoption of sex role theory. Sex role theory, by the way, when we go back a few layers, what I call biological determinism is more or less equivalent to sex role theory. Here's the roles that it means for what it means to be a man. I find a lot of truth in this, and I've encountered, my perspective of what he's pointing to in men's work in various ways. That it prescribes a particular way that men should be through the archetypes, and it advocates for masculine men to be dominant and assertive while saying, but that's not patriarchy, like sweeping that word away. So this is the argument here. And again, it's pulling apart what doesn't work about masculinity, and that's what's really indicative from this paradigm of consciousness. The social construction of gender is the gender theory that I will put in this bucket. And the idea here is that gender exists only because society agrees and acts as if it exists. We lived in a world where nobody talked about gender, we didn't treat each other differently, and we didn't have language that was gendered, we wouldn't have gender. In addition, how we experience gender socially also intersects with these other social constructions of race, class, religion, etc. Our gender includes our identity, so how I view myself as male, man or woman, or any of the other gender identities out there, our expression, the roles that we play, and our status that we hold in society. These norms are implicitly taught to each individual and then continually reinforced through our social interactions. And the quote here is that we are doing gender. So there is no essential gender. There is no sex role. It's just something that, we happen to have evolved as a culture, but there's no real there. Again, kernels of truth. Finally, the next paradigm, or kind of, the top of the ladder that we're going to consider today, is integral masculinity. And I'll caveat this by saying this is still emerging. It hasn't really popped into the cultural sphere yet. We're getting there. There are people writing about it and talking about it, but it's not fully formed. So a lot of this is speculative, and a lot of this is my interpretation, as you will see. But the integral form of masculinity is holistic. It is self-actualizing. It is interconnected with life, and that forms the core. Whereas in the prior paradigm, we're deconstructing and there is no core. Here, we've kind of found the core and we're building up from that core. Masculinity at this paradigm of consciousness refers to itself, or people in this paradigm refer to conscious masculinity or sacred masculinity. I put them in quotes because all forms of masculinity are aspects of consciousness, and all of life is sacred. So every layer has its version of sacred masculinity. But what happens when we get to this layer is a recognition of the sacredness, a recognition of how consciousness moves through all beings. And so that label then gets applied to all sorts of different things, including the masculine. In his light at this level, this man is synthesizing. He's multidisciplinary. He's purpose-driven, regenerative, and embodied. In his shadow, spiritual bypassing. So using spirituality to move beyond truth, to not connect to shadow elements or uncomfortable elements, but painting this bright picture. Spiritual materialism kind of goes hand in hand, but is distinct. Spiritual materialism is I'm harnessing my spiritual identity to aggrandize myself. Because I practice all of this spiritual and I know how to speak this spiritual and I've studied all these things, look at me, look how great I am. Pedestaling goes right along with that. And then there can be this sense of being impatient for others to become as evolved as I am here at Integral, here at the top of the ladder, so to speak, or an arrogance of like, look at me, I'm an Integral. That's really the joke. One of the great jokes of integral theory is that by studying integral theory, it causes sudden onset of running around saying, look at me, I'm an Integral. It's certainly true for me when I first encountered this theory. I was like, whoa. But there's a level of arrogance, like, the ladder that I have here, it's at the top. And what makes integral special and what we're doing here is that the integral perspective is able to appreciate the developmental sequence that all individual humans must go through and that all collectives must go through. And each one has its own place and is valuable in and of itself. The shadow of this is, look at me, I'm at the top, I'm above or better than all of you. So there's not a gender theory, so far as I'm aware, out in the world that calls itself integral masculinity. But where I propose gender theory from and how I engage with masculinity is from this integral level of consciousness. So here is the definition of masculinity that I gave in yesterday's talk, word for word, just copied over the slide. And now we can fit it in to the sequence of paradigms. So the masculinity that is experienced through the heart's natural and innate recognition of the masculine, that is the core of masculine. We find it within ourselves. When I go in and feel, and there's that recognition, that is what masculinity is. From that core, we build out everything else. Masculinity is seen as one member of a primal trinity of sexual diversification, together with the feminine and the androgen. It contextually defines itself through polarity with the feminine. Masculinity and each one of these three gender high archetypes is a morphic field, a primal groove in consciousness that spans archetype, gender, and sex. It constellates through these different layers of psychospiritual experience. This field evolves throughout humanity, cultures, generations, and individuals. It's constantly changing and growing. And its expression constellates uniquely within and between each individual. We each have our own flavor of what masculinity is. So there is one morphic field, one primal groove in consciousness, which is masculinity. But then as it comes into each one of us, we have our own unique and original expression, interpretation, and identity through it. So this is what I would offer as the future, like the next wave of how we think about masculinity and more broadly, gender. Final point here. Locating the organic masculine. So we may be tempted to say that the integral version of masculinity is the right one. That's where the organic masculine lives. What I would like to offer is that each of the paradigms we've considered has its wounds and its shadows. Some of them have been around much longer, and some of them occupy and wield greater authority and power within our culture. So we see the wounds a lot more. In addition, each paradigm has its gifts and serves as a necessary step on the developmental ladder. Not only is each one part of how we get to integral at the top, but each one is in itself valuable and has its gifts. It does its own thing. We wouldn't be here without it. So even though there is a hierarchy of growth and development, there is not a hierarchy of value. Higher rungs on the ladder are not more valuable than lower rungs. So the analogy that I'll give here is when you consider a second grader and a sixth grader. You don't say that a sixth grader is a more valuable human being, even though the sixth grader can read at a higher level and do arithmetic at a higher level and is more advanced in many ways than a second grader. They're both completely lovable, completely valuable members of humanity. And that's what we're pointing to, what I'm pointing to here is that wherever you are, wherever we are on the ladder, we are equally valuable. Therefore, life-affirming masculinity, organic masculinity, exists within every paradigm. So the organic masculine is through all of these paradigms, not just the one at the top. And for those of us who have had the privilege, fortunate life circumstances, and capacity to show up for this talk today, honestly, and to receive this level of information, our work is to foster healthy versions within each paradigm. When we fight against these other paradigms and say, you're wrong, you're backwards, you're stupid, you're crazy, whatever, what that does is it pushes members of that paradigm to the extreme, to fundamentalism. And rather what we want collectively in our culture is healthy versions of each one of these ladders and the opportunity, the empowerment of its members to grow in the way that they know how to move themselves up the ladder. So that's what we want to do, foster healthy versions within each paradigm. And that is kind of the larger vision of men's work as a social movement as I see it in our culture today. So this is the end of the content, and I will open it up for questions or shares. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll just add, that if I go all the way back to this guy at the mythic traditional layer paradigm of consciousness, like 10 years ago, before I really started engaging in this kind of language would have really triggered me. I would have said, this is dangerous. Look at all the harm that this type of thinking has caused. And yes, we want to recognize that there is harm that people at this level propagate. At the same time, that was pointing to my own shadow, the place where I was unintegrated at this level because I don't hang out at this layer of consciousness a lot. Today, like as I was doing research for this talk, I opened up this guy's book and I was like, man, I love this. Everything this guy's saying, like it's kind of cheesy, like it's a little over the top, but seriously, life-affirming masculinity, manhood that makes a family whole, woman safe, child confident, and a community strong. Like from that lens of reality, that's it. That is life-affirming masculinity. And so looking through these different paradigms, we can also find the places where we are holding judgment or separation or wounds and use it as a form of shadow work to come into more integration within ourselves.
Matt, I'm not going on video right now.
Okay.
At this point, what I see, we are probably in the current generation, we are more on the, not on the integral, rather plural kind of situation is what we are right now. Is that right? In the consciousness level?
So in American culture, the largest subculture, the largest collective, the highest we've gotten to is plural postmodern.
Mm-hmm.
But where the largest bucket of people is the mythic traditional, people who go to church regularly, basically. This is, by the way, one of the key insights of this system, looking at the developmental ladder, is you can't skip rungs. So the next step for the largest bucket of humans in our culture is the step into the full freedom of the rational mind and self-expression thereof. It's out of the in-group, out-group thinking, participation of the traditional paradigm. So if we look at, quote, those people and try to get them up to speed on integral or even postmodern and say, you should be here, that's going to miss, because the next natural developmental step is into mental modern paradigm. And from the mental modern paradigm, the next natural step that you have to go through is into the plural postmodern paradigm.
Matt,
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that. I was just wondering about, about that ability to skip steps. And what you're saying is believable to me, that like those steps are somehow inherent in, it just in our nature, and that we need to take those steps in order to get there. And I could imagine that it's sort of historical, like that's how it went as our developed, and that an individual isn't tied to like recapitulate what the culture did.
Right.
So I guess my question is, like how you see that that's true, or what convinces you that that's true?
Yeah. So there is a psychological model called ego development theory. And the woman to look up, her name is Susan Cook Gruder. And they have done, basically what they did is extensive testing with adults in America and Europe. And through that testing, they empirically came up with, okay, these are the main buckets. And then looking at those results over time, they noticed you have to go from one to the other. You can't skip. So there's evidence backing this up. But more intuitively, as we grow from childhood, we all start at the very basic consciousness, kind of connected with the mother, and we start to individuate. And so just intuitively, if we took like a toddler and tried to teach that toddler how to be a teenager, like rebelling and asserting itself and finding its freedom, it doesn't work. And that's kind of a simplistic analogy, but I think it holds here. We have to grow through the process, and the process has its own intelligence.
Yeah, thank you.
Totally.
Hi, Matt. Would you mind sharing some perspective as you've continued to be on your journey and watch and shift yourself through paradigms and maybe your lifetime? Speak to any experience regarding how to mitigate impatience with society as a whole and or maybe arrogance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So when we study how to study these paradigms, and we look at like, okay, what's our theory of change here? How do we actually grow? The famous quote from Ken Wilber is that studying consciousness is psychoactive. So by looking at the lens through which I view the world, and by making that subjective lens the object of what I'm studying, my whole worldview gets bigger. So what we did today by looking at these different paradigms is evolving our consciousness. The more that we think about it, the more that we develop our own perspectives on it, wherever that perspective takes you, even if you disagree with me, that is what leads to the evolution of a more holistic and more complex, more all-pervasive worldview. What we're doing here is the process. We're engaging it right now. Now, to your second question, or like the follow-on around the impatience for other people to get there, we really have to trust that each person knows, given the right conditions and given the right support, what is best for them. And so our job is not to be proscriptive, hey, you all need to get here, but rather empowering. When we empower all members of our society and give them more options and trust them to choose what's right for them, there's a natural wisdom that we all tap into. And in addition, empowering all people is just kind of like the right thing or a better thing to do anyway. But it turns out to be the most effective approach.
Thank you, Matt. And would you mind expanding on that last point regarding maybe a suggestion on how one can empower somebody and just, I don't know if you have any specific examples of that, just in a day-to-day kind of sense.
Yes. I mean, in a day-to-day kind of sense, it is talking with people, being curious, getting to know who they are. But more collectively, when we make the shift from mythic traditional to mental modern, largely that happens in universities and colleges. So education is a major way, access to higher education is a major way that collectively we can start to empower the shift from mythic traditional into mental modern. And also academia is where the plural postmodern is like really firmly centered right now. So that's primarily where people start to access those paradigms. And that's one of the big shifts that we could like advocate for in our world.
Understood. And it sounds like on an individual basis, compassion's really going to be a key metric and
yes,
getting us all through it.
Yes, compassion is absolutely a key metric. Mm-hmm.
So what I understand at this point is basically right now, when we are making change, it's for lack of better word, we are making changes in the next generation of people who are coming into this, right? Rather than, if I take my personal situation, I'm actually dealing with the mystic proposition of like previous generation was still there, while I'm trying to be in one level, and then I have a next level of generation who's in the college, right? So making that change, probably I'd be saying that it's going to take longer time for us to catch up to these levels, like the mental to the plural stuff.
Well, it's a good question. And we don't know is the answer. Because even though the Age of Enlightenment happened, the largest bucket of people hasn't stepped into it yet across the globe. However, there is a tipping point effect. The Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, that revolution happened over the course of 2 generations. It was like very quick, where we went from monarchy and church rule to democracy. Like everything changed when like enough people got it. And it's theorized that by doing what we're doing here, when enough people get on to the integral paradigm of consciousness, there will be a similar revolution. And remember, the Enlightenment age touched every facet of life for Western civilization. Everything changed very rapidly when that happened. So the most important thing that we can do is work on ourselves and study this. And then as we study it, how we talk, who we talk to, what we engage with in the world will naturally permeate out from that lens, that worldview, and start to turn the flywheel more and more. It's a question in the chat. 100 monkey theory. Yeah, totally. Okay. So I'm going to close it up here. I want to say thank you to everybody for showing up. Thanks for your engagement. It's a real pleasure to get to hear your questions and get to like dig into some of this stuff with you. And tomorrow we'll be talking about masculine archetypes. So another really juicy topic. All right.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Mhm.